Turkish Airlines presents Business Africa.
Hello and welcome to this new edition of Business Africa. I'm Yasmina El Abbasi-Ray and the headlines. In Tunisia, Kaïs Saïed has been re-elected for a second term as the country sinks into an unprecedented economic crisis. Rwanda aims to improve key sectors for an inclusive economic model. And fishing in Africa, a vital issue for food security and sustainable development. Tunisia has been experiencing an economic crisis since the Arab Spring, a situation that's worsened under the previous term of President Kaïs Saïed. Re-elected last Sunday, Saïed will face major challenges impacting the lives of millions of Tunisians.
As Tunisian President Kaïs Saïed begins his second term, the country's economy continues to face major challenges. Inflation, the depreciation of the country's currency dinar, and the burden of debt are all negatively affecting the economic situation. GDP growth reached only 1% in the second quarter of 2024, while unemployment hovers around 16%. Despite signs of improvement, such as inflation dropping to 6.7%, most Tunisians still feel the impact of a sluggish economy. The country is now grappling with deep structural problems. Public debt has soared to 71% of GDP, largely due to a development model focused on public investment. Basic services like water and electricity are often inadequate, and food shortages are now becoming common. The economic crisis has direct effects on Tunisians' daily lives. Supermarket shelves are frequently empty, and power outages are a regular occurrence. Reliance on foreign aid and tourism revenues has also limited the country's ability to recover independently. To revive the economy, stronger private sector involvement is now crucial. Encouraging domestic savings and supporting entrepreneurship will now be key steps in building a sustainable economic future.
We welcome Mr. Ghazi Ben Hamid, founder and president of the Mediterranean Development Initiative think tank. Thank you for accepting our invitation. What are the main factors behind the current economic crisis in Tunisia?
I remind your viewers that Tunisia is experiencing a serious economic crisis, but this isn't new. Already during the Arab Spring, we had an economic crisis, a crisis of wealth sharing. Today, the crisis is even more serious because we are no longer creating wealth. So we have a more serious crisis than before, perhaps the most serious crisis in our modern history, which may seem paradoxical because when we know that the president, Kaïs Saïed, has all the powers in his hands, but one explanation would be that he adopted an austerity economy by reducing imports of consumer goods and capital goods without exports of capital goods. Tunisia no longer produces and no longer exports. I will just briefly remind your viewers that we have a bloated civil service. When we pay the salaries of the civil service and employees of public companies, it amounts to 44% of state expenditure. When we pay pensions, social security, outstanding debt and debt service, there's no money left for the state to invest.
Some data has revealed that the economic situation is less dire than forecast.
The forecasts are what they are, but at what price? I mean, this austerity policy that has led to shortages of all kinds has generated late payments, huge unpaid bills. Today, companies, even public ones, are struggling to pay their suppliers. We need to look quite more carefully. And I would like to remind you that we are one of the only countries in the region that have not returned to pre-pandemic growth levels.
Can Tunisia recover without a loan from the IMF?
I am convinced that sooner or later we will need the IMF, perhaps a joint response from the IMF, the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, a bit like the Greek model. But there are preconditions for this to happen. We really need to have a vision on both sides. What model for Tunisia? We need to communicate. We need to explain to the Tunisians, because even the opposition is against a program with the IMF, because they really see it as interference and conditions that could put Tunisia at risk. I say that the absence of an agreement with the IMF is even greater in terms of risks.
What economic reforms are necessary to improve Tunisia's economic situation in the long term?
Listen, there's a whole bunch of economic reforms that were already planned in the free trade agreement with the European Union. Today, we don't have an agricultural policy. We have a food policy that consists of squeezing farmers to get food at a lower price. That has no future, especially since we're also experiencing climate change. We're also facing all sorts of standards and specifications from importing countries. So we will need an agricultural policy. We will need a services policy. We will need to liberalize services. We cannot have a competitive industry without competitive services. And then we must fight against rentier capitalism. We must fight against corruption. We must reduce subsidies. We must target the poorest. It is not normal for the richest to tourists to eat subsidized bread or drive around with subsidized gasoline to get all this going. We really need a vision. We must also reduce the wage bill. You know that today in Tunisia, 1 in 4 workers is a civil servant. We're perhaps the only country in the world where the tobacco monopoly is in deficit, unable to make money. So the recipe in the end is quite simple. We must let the private sector create jobs. I sincerely believe that Tunisia has the means to get out of this by its own means.
Mr. Ben Ahmed, thank you for accepting this invitation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Rwanda aspires to become a middle-income economy by 2035 and to join high-income countries by 2050. With a GDP per capita that has quadrupled in 25 years, the Rwandan economy stands out on the continent.
Rwanda has demonstrated remarkable economic resilience, with real GDP rising 9.7% in the first quarter of this year, surpassing last year's 8.2% growth. This growth is driven by strong consumption in the service sector. The industrial sector also stood out with a 10% increase, mainly due to manufacturing and construction, which grew by 11% and 12% respectively. The information and communication technology ICT sector experienced a spectacular surge, growing by 35%.
The financial sector is also growing very fast. The average growth has been close to 20% in the last 10 years. Rwanda wants to build very good financial sector so that it becomes a financial hub for the region and for Africa maybe.
Despite these positive developments, Rwanda faces ongoing challenges, including inflation and a limited trained workforce. Only 2.8 million people are employed full-time out of 8.1 million of working age.
There
are a number of indications that the country has a long way to go before it reaches its socio-economic objectives. It remains one of the poorest countries in the world, with 50% of its population living below the poverty line. Much work is needed in education and healthcare to develop a workforce and population that can meet the ambitions of the leadership. To maximize the potential of its youth, Rwanda is now focusing on skills development. A $200 million project aims to provide 200,000 vulnerable young people with the necessary skill for the labor market. The country aims to reach middle-income status by 2035 and high-income status by 2050.
The fishing sector in Africa is a vital part of the continent's economy and food security. With its vast maritime resources, fishing supports millions of jobs and is essential for feeding the population. However, major challenges persist.
The fishing sector is crucial to Africa, which has a significant part of its territory covered by water bodies. The sector employs over 12 million people and ensures food security for over 200 million Africans. In Africa, 22% of animal protein comes from seafood, and in some West African countries, the figure exceeds 50%. Yet per capita fish consumption is alarmingly low, at less than 10 kilos per year and only 5 kilos in East Africa. Illegal fishing and overexploitation of stocks deprive local communities of essential proteins and income to the benefit of food systems in Europe and Asia. They are also threats to marine and continental resources. Countries such as Morocco have already put in place rigorous legislation to regulate fishing techniques, impose seasons, and limit the intensity of industrial fishing. Increasingly, so-called second-generation fishing agreements are emerging, such as the one signed between Senegal and the European Union in 2019, which allows EU fishermen to take a quota of 10,000 tons per year. Artisanal fishing, which accounts for 66% of the continent's fisheries, is a key asset for African nations in meeting the challenges of sustainable development. Greater political support for the sector and the definition of a sustainable strategy for inland fishing and aquaculture on the continent could have a significant impact on the food security of millions in Africa.
This concludes this edition. Thank you for watching, and find us on our platforms and at africanews.com.
Business Africa was presented by Turkish Airlines.